Let's introduce our panel.
Test everybody. All right, hey, I'm Danny Szlauderbach, co-director of the movie you just saw.
I'm John, I sing with the band.
I'm Bill, I play guitar.
Yeah, Rauser, I sort of followed the band for a while.
Excellent. So when I first interviewed you, the band in 2006, it had been 17 years since you played live. And it's 17 years since then. I guess my question is, back then you were talking about the documentary then. What took so long?
I guess that's a question for me. What year was that?
2006.
So that was when my collaborator, Dan Featherston, who should be here, but he and his wife are expecting their first child later this summer, so travel plans are limited. But so he started it back in 2005, and that's what sparked the 3 reunion shows that they did. And I was like 18 then, and I was a big fan, and I had this idea in mind. But he was in a band of his own. It was called Oxford Collapse, and they toured the world. And like documentaries do, it kind of was shelved. And it wasn't until 2019. I started in 2017, but I let him do his own thing for a couple years. I didn't want to interfere. And in 2019 is when I emailed him, and we spent lockdown doing this thing.
Another lockdown product.
There you go.
Outstanding. Question for the band. Watching this on film, what was the most surprising thing you learned about other band members?
I did learn something the first time I saw it, but that was like last year. I can't remember. Let me think about it. I did learn something very surprising. But meanwhile, I'm gonna think.
John, what about you?
Well, I would say I found out how the band broke up. I didn't understand it. There were a bunch of people broke it up.
Did you think it was you?
Well, it could have been, but then out of left field, there's Brent. Brent said he did it, and then, I don't know. It's pretty wild.
Was there anything else in the movie that just generally surprised you, looking back on it from a distance?
I'd like to address the boxed set audience here. I know Michael Carmody. He's a great guy. He's a really good songwriter. He's a fine fellow. He too often speaks from the lip, and he was just flat wrong there. Lawrence has always had a terrific music scene. It's why the band came here the first time they played outside of Woodstock. Lawrence has always been great. The only thing Lawrence didn't have was the embarrassment.
HAHK was important for that. Healthy music scene. Was that mentioned in the movie? KJHK? Yeah.
You kept getting mistaken for a band from Lawrence. Was that just because of the record label having the address, Fresh Sounds Lawrence?
I think it's partially because of REM. Mike Mills from REM, I think, when Spin first came out in the mid-80s, name dropped the Embarrassment as one of the bands like them that could have exploded in a town like Athens. And he said the Embarrassment from Lawrence, Kansas. And I think it probably stuck. Yeah.
Did you obviously amassed a group of fans from Jonathan Demme to Evan Danda, placements, etc. Were there any others not mentioned in the documentary that you knew were fans of the Embarrassment?
I mean, we had Mills. It was very close to Mike Mills from REM. And Dan just missed him in New York by a day. They said, okay, we'll meet you there, and he had to be out of town.
I think Craig Scanlon, the guitarist in the Fall at the time, or one of the guitarists, took a liking to us, all except for the name of the band. And Brian Brain, Martin Atkins, in other words, the Public Image Limited drummer. We kind of hit it off with him just by randomly running into him. Well, first it was the Pill show, but then soon after that he was touring his solo act, the Brian Brain Project, and we'd run into him in Minneapolis, I think, in Chicago, and hey, remember you? And
But you've been sending T-shirts all around the world recently, right?
I just sent a T-shirt to somebody in Italy, and they understood they were going to have to pay like over $60 in shipping costs and fees and taxes, and on top of the price of the shirt. So
I'm still curious about, I mean, we saw a snippet of it in the movie, but when it says Allen Ginsberg dropped off the tapes, I've always been curious about that. I mean, we have documents from Dan's well-kept files, but the connection...
Another Lawrence connection, no doubt.
I would assume Burroughs, yeah?
Yeah. Generally, all roads lead to Burroughs.
Yeah.
So why didn't they like the name The Embarrassment? I mean, you could have gone with the Lemurs. I mean, because The Embarrassment is a great name, no matter how you cut it.
I think we all recognized that kind of at the same time when it showed up on the piece of paper. Right? It was like, wow, it took a lot of trial and error, you know.
It's like a high art concept in itself, right? Like it's the perfect name.
Danny, Danny, this obviously was a very complicated movie to put together. There is all kinds of stuff in here. What was the single most challenging aspect of assembling this?
Well, yeah, it is a patchwork, obviously. We've got footage from 2005, 2006. We've got audio, video footage from archival all over the place. Video, you know, that's the digital age makes remote video editing possible. It's insane how, like, it's one of the most surprising things that happened. Not just that Dan Featherston was willing to do it, you know, I never took that for granted. That you could just call somebody up and say, like, hey, I've been thinking about this too, and we're just like, share everything and on the same wavelength, and there's no issue about, you know, sharing credit or anything like that. But it's amazing how you can, I don't want to go down the road for video editing software, but that was challenging at some points. But I think we were both smashing our keyboards at a certain point, trying to get our shared sequences to line up. But I mean, for me, Dan and Bill are still in Wichita, so I was able to travel and meet with them a few times. But it was when I realized that I'm not going to be able to travel the country and meet up with John in Florida or Boston with Woody, unless I started spending time on my own movie. But so that was the challenge for me. It was like, how is this thing going to get finished? And that's why I called it eventually.
I wasn't still in Wichita, but fortunately I had returned to Wichita 10 years ago, and you came along like a little while after that. But
you're a little skeptical, right? You're like,
yeah.
No, I've heard of this before.
Yeah, we've been down this road before. Let me tell you about it. Do you tell the story of that interesting time that you first met Dan Featherston in person?
Oh, last fall, yeah. We made the entire movie together, and we didn't meet until it premiered in Wichita last October.
That's weird.
Restored.
Songs that we never got a chance to really fully flesh out. Let's revisit some songs. Let's also put some new ideas in, and let's also include kind of things that interest us now without trying to follow some expected sound or theme that people might be expecting. We wanted to be ourselves in the studio, and over that period of the decade, pretty much we had, you know, all gotten interested in other things too. So we wanted to bring that all in and let it feel organic and natural, because that's always what we were feeling best.
It's also working with the engineer/producer there, the studio.
Well, we went from Wichita then out to Boston. So you mean Lou Giordano in Boston, who I'd gotten to know through our Big Dipper work just in the previous 4 years, really. But he was at it was this legendary Fort Apache studio, which it was just kind of a given in Boston. That's where everybody felt comfortable recording. But then that ended up becoming more legendary because, soon after that, the Pixies were doing their recordings there, and then based on that kind of reputation, bands like Radiohead and British bands were coming across the pond to record.
Do you want me to turn it on?
People.
Next question.
This question, I'm going to direct the question at Dan, but it's addressed to anyone who wishes to respond. But Dan, or whoever, can you speak to possibly the capacity of Wichita, the energy, the creative energy that exists in that city, partly because of the level of compression and gravitational pull, this is sort of Wichita experience that I have lived in as well. Can you speak to the tension that exists between how important it feels to create in Wichita and how difficult it is to exceed that gravitational pull, or to just leave and then just want to come back, snap back to it? Can you speak to that?
Yeah, it's very difficult. It cuts both ways. It cuts both ways. First of all, you're in what you see as a cultural vacuum, but you also have no big influences that are there to tell you, well, you must do this, you must do that. And so it enabled these guys to write these enormously quirky and wonderful songs. And I think had they been in New York or Miami, LA, any big city, they probably wouldn't have done that. So it works both ways. A brilliant artist like yourself can come out of Wichita. But I would like to say one more thing about the songs. This documentary is a little jewel, much like some of the Embarrassment songs. Several of those songs, I believe, belong in the Great American Songbook.
Dan, you want to add something to that?
I was just going to talk about how much Dan and I talked about using the image of Wichita in Kansas as it's sort of like the antagonist in the movie, right? Like it's probably the first thing that, like, when people first hear about the Embarrassment, there's this mystery to it. Like, how could this thing come out of a place like that? And part of the reason that I think Thomas Frank wrote about it in What's the Matter with Kansas, which for me really, like, when you're wondering like whether something like this is like worth an endeavor that's worth like pursuing, because there's a lot of bands out there that like we all love and that came from here that just never crossed over, and then when you find out that like a guy who's writing a book about perhaps the most important thing, like the most topical thing, which is like the replacement of economics with culture wars and political discourse to the point where we're not talking about anything that matters. And he names one band, and he quotes one band, and that's the Embarrassment. It's one of those things that really was a turning point for me. And in Wichita, it could have gone the way where it was just like a few demo recordings that we heard. Right? It's like that image of Robert Johnson, the blues musician, where it's just like one image that we have. And it's like a ghostly image. And we're like, maybe he was the greatest blues musician ever. But instead, the Embarrassment, we have, all the photos from Mike Pfizer and Henry Nelson. We have this entire like treasure chest of photos and video. And so this idea that it wasn't just like a blip. It was like they were creating this scene away from the coast, away from the infrastructure of the entertainment industry, and the fact that they were able to make that happen despite like the cultural gravitational pull of Wichita that you're talking about, like that was to me that's like the thing that makes this whole thing worthwhile.
Nice. Other questions?
I'm just still curious to know do you still not know where your other band member is? The one that disappeared to Costa Rica? What happened?
Ron Klaus actually is living somewhere in the Phoenix area. He's in contact with one of the Bagby, with Sam Bagby, but he is absolutely reclusive when it comes to participation in anything other than whatever it is he's doing in Phoenix.
Is that because he's scared he's going to get arrested for destroying that house?
Well, no, the house, he was exonerated right away because this guy had told him, I'm going to tear down the house. So once he went down and fessed up to the police and said, I'm the guy, and told them the story, they were like, okay, go and sin no more.
Nice. Got time for one more question. Up there.
Oh boy, the pressure. I don't know if this question warrants being the last one, but so I just have to put this thing to rest in my mind. I don't know where the source was years ago, but there was a story or a rumor that Joan Jett was once interested in buying Sex Drive. Was that?
Rumor, perhaps?
Well,
I heard that rumor.
Yeah, we heard that. It's not buying it, but apparently she was looking at utilizing it. But again, what happened? We were famous, and then we weren't.
All right, folks.
I like to think we weren't famous, but you do remember us.
Nice. So we are going to have a quick 10-minute break, and then the band is going to play. Thank you.